This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
He has a different and controversial approach to helping America's wounded veterans. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade on this edition of Conversations. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade has become somewhat of a lightning rod for his stance on how the VA should approach taking care of our wounded veterans. Gade is not a big proponent of paying wounded vets a regular disability check. He would rather see incentives that encourage jobs and entrepreneurship. As you might imagine, this stance has its share of critics. Whether you agree or disagree, you must respect his credibility. Gade is not some pandering politician, but rather an accomplished and decorated military officer who was wounded in the line of duty. Gade's career has taken him from Iraq to the White House, where he served as a policy advisor to George W. Bush. Lieutenant Colonel Gade has a host of awards and decorations, including 2 Purple Hearts. Currently, he is an assistant professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point. We're glad to have Lieutenant Daniel Gade with us. Lieutenant Colonel, I should say, Daniel Gade with us on this edition of Conversations. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
What are your thoughts on how we should handle our wounded veterans?
Well, that's a big question. We have a remarkable system because the system has been designed over, so let me take you back to some history. So the modern way of taking care of veterans really has its roots in the post-World War I era, where all these guys came back from the front in Europe, many of them wounded, et cetera. And so the roots of the VA go way back to the 1920s. What's ironic is that over time, we've built layer after layer after layer of new systems to try to patch over problems in the way that the VA takes care of people without ever really re-examining our fundamental assumptions. For example, one of the fundamental assumptions that the VA operates under is this thing called the medical model of disability. The medical model of disability in short terms is basically that if you have a certain diagnosis, then that diagnosis equals a certain level of disability, right? So I'm a hip level amputee from an IED strike in 2005. They would say that just the amputation is a 90% disability. Well, that might have been true in 1945 when the last time the rating schedule was comprehensively rewritten right after World War II. In an industrial economy, a hip level amputation is a big deal. And in somebody who has, who isn't as educated, a hip level amputation is a big deal in terms of its impact on earnings. For me, the impact on my earnings has actually been nil. I've had zero impact on my earnings. I spent a year in the hospital. I stayed on active duty during my time in the hospital, of course, and then instead of medically retiring from the Army, I decided to stay on active duty in the Army. I've been promoted twice. I'm able to do my job just fine because I'm a college professor, right? I'm a teacher. And so we as a country have never really re-examined our position on what gets paid, how much those things get paid, and what makes sense for our veterans. And so what we have now is a system that's built up over time. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like a coral reef, right? You just start with something small, and pretty soon you get this huge coral reef of bureaucracy. And my contention, and what a lot of science and a lot of research shows, is that the current system is really hurting our veterans, particularly our young veterans. So let me give you a scenario. Okay. You are a 22-year-old from Kentucky. You're from a lower middle class family. Your dad's a farmer or something like that, and the most money he's ever earned maybe per year is $35,000 or $40,000, right at the U.S. median income. He's worked his tail off. He's doing honorable work, but it's not very financially rewarding work in most cases. So you go off to Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever, some awful place. And the term I like is you get scuffed up a little bit. You get a little scuffed up. And then you come back to Walter Reed or to one of the other military treatment facilities. And you're put into this really interesting position where on the one hand, you can stay at the military treatment facility for a long time, and you get treated like a hero. You get brought up on stage at the concert, and everybody says you're a hero. You get brought out to the 50-yard line of the football game, and you get to flip the coin. You get to, you go through this hero phase, or you get to face life on the outside of the Army. You have to pursue a different identity. And when you start to look at the pursuit of a different identity thing, what happens is these young veterans are saying, I can stay in the Army for a long time, and I can continue to be treated as a hero. I can continue to stay in this treatment sort of mentality for a long time. Or I can seek my own fortune on the outside, and seeking my fortune on the outside is pretty scary anyway. Mm-hmm. So then we get to our next hurdle, and the next hurdle is this. Many of the programs that face veterans, I call them headwinds, right? Mm-hmm. Many of the programs that we have to help veterans are really headwinds. So a guy who's sort of moderately wounded, let's say he's a 50 or 60%, the VA would rate him a 50 or 60% disability. They'll give him about $1,500 a month. Most places that's tax-free, and it's a regular payment for the rest of his life. And in some cases, he can get up to $3,000 a month from his $1,500 as long as he doesn't work. But if he goes back to work, he loses that $1,500.
Okay.
So it takes him back to his base level. That's a program called individual unemployability. And so what that does is it provides this really high implicit tax on labor. So if you go out and you begin to make your way in the labor market, as soon as you start to get off the ground, you punch through this limit called substantial gainful activity. I know it's sort of technical, but you punch through this $1,000 a month limit on substantial gainful activity. And once you punch through $1,000, you lose the $1,500 and you go back to your base rate of $1,500. So we've created, on accident, a poverty trap for veterans where if you go back to work and you begin to strive, you begin to succeed, we're going to punch you in the gut as hard as we can with $1,500 penalty. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that happens, a lot of these guys also qualify for Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI. SSDI also has that same substantial gainful activity limit, and so it forms a really high implicit tax on labor. And so what you get is a guy who says, yeah, I'd really like to work, but he gets basically taxed to death if he starts to work. Or he can sit back at home and collect disability benefits. So what we have is guys trapped in this disability benefit-seeking behavior. And then they say, well, if I'm going to be trapped in disability, I may as well maximize my disability payments. And so there's this reapplication process. They reapply for a higher level of disability. They say, oh, you know what? Not only is my right leg messed up, my knee hurts a little bit. My other knee hurts a little bit too. And so I'm going to apply for that. I'm going to apply for this. I'm going to apply for that. And so pretty soon guys are creeping up what we call the disability escalator. And so they end up reapplying and reapplying and reapplying and potentially they face a temptation at least to exaggerate their conditions or to focus on what's wrong with them instead of focusing on what's good about them. And so pretty soon they try to get to 100% disability, which is about $3,200 a month, which remind you in this scenario, that's what his dad was making his whole life anyway,
right,
for working.
Right.
And now the veteran is sitting at home drawing this 100% disability. And he goes through a really ugly process that I call it's kind of an identity shift process. So I'll take you and your viewers back to the last time you were on an airplane. Mm-hmm. You sat next to somebody, and the first question they said, hey, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm Jeff Weeks. I'm this, I'm that, and the other. And they asked me, and I'm Dan Gade. I'm a Army officer and a teacher and so forth. And only at the end of the flight, when you finally make it to Atlanta or wherever you're going, does somebody say, oh yeah, what's your name? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because what's important about us in our society isn't actually our name. It's not our true identity. It's what we do for a living, right? And so what happens with a young veteran who is paid to be sick, he's paid to be disabled, is he begins to identify with that disability mindset. And what disability, the word, is a really kind of an ugly word actually. It just means I can't, Right. And so he gets trapped, and it's really sad, actually.
And you've said apparently your research indicates that the veterans who are in that situation have higher instances of drug abuse, alcohol, and so on and so forth.
Of course they do. Yeah. They have all of that, in addition to the fact that from a public policy perspective, it's a disaster because now we're paying that guy to be sick, so we're spending money on him directly, but we're also prying him away from the labor market. So now he's not working, he's not paying taxes. He's not contributing to society. He's not creating new products or ideas or labor. He's receiving, and so it's a double whammy for society. We pay him directly, and we deny his future benefit to society. It's really pretty grim.
How would you like to see it fixed?
So there are a number of ways, there are a number of things that would make a lot of sense. First, we ought to discuss what is disability, what is the disability compensation system for? What is its purpose? The official Title 38 U.S. Code definition says that the purpose of disability compensation is to pay for income loss due to injuries incurred in service, basically. But what we see in the actual implementation of the system is that it's paying for far more than just income loss. It's paying for pain and suffering, which is important. Mm-hmm. It's paying for a variety of things which are important, but which stray from the official purpose. The other thing that we need to look at is what exactly is a disability, right? So I talked about the medical model earlier. The more modern way of thinking about disability is what we call the social model. So the social model is cool because it doesn't take into account just the diagnosis. Diagnosis equals disability. That's the medical model. The social model says diagnosis plus the conditions around the veteran, both societal conditions and personal conditions. In other words, how educated is the person? Where does he live? What supports does he have? All that stuff. All of those things equal the effect of that diagnosis on his life, right? So what's funny, or what's sad actually, is that the VA's disability rating scheme, the thousands of page book that says, okay, this is what this disability means and all that stuff, it compensates for things that most regular citizens don't even know is compensated for. So, for example, the number one most common condition that people are paid disability payments for in this is in 2013, but it doesn't change much year over year, is tinnitus, ringing in the ears, right?
Okay.
The second one is like lumbosacral strain, which is just, your back hurts. The third most common, or the fourth most common, is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a real condition, right. No question about it. But you see these conditions in the top 10 list, which most people wouldn't say are disabilities. They're conditions. They're part of life on Earth, right? But everybody gets them. I'm 40, and my back doesn't feel like it did when I was 20. And is that the Army's fault? Is that the government's fault? I don't think so, Mm-hmm. And so in America's mind, they're paying for guys who've sustained catastrophic injuries to get compensated for those injuries. That's great. In reality, they're paying for aging-related issues that aren't real disabilities, that are really just conditions. And so we need to rethink what is the system for and who ought to be most paid for it. And the third thing I'd like to see, and this is a more fundamental shift, mm-hmm. and you talked about it in your intro, is basically that instead of paying for debility, we ought to pay for ability, right? We ought to compensate people to thrive, to live up to their maximum capacity. I think that there's all kinds of research that shows that your activity in the labor market is what defines you, mm-hmm. and so I think we ought to, and that has real positive impacts. It's a real protective factor, is what we say, against bad outcomes. Being regularly employed is really helpful in a lot of ways, right? And so, one of the things that we ought to be thinking about is paying bonuses for people who are fully employed, right? Give them the maximum training, give them the maximum, whatever assistive devices they need, whatever retraining they need. We ought to be giving that to them, and then we ought to be launching them out into the labor market and saying, "Hey, do the best you can, mm-hmm. and whatever you do, we're going to reward you." Now, combine that with a strong safety net. Right. But incentivize people to succeed. And that would be a fundamental shift in how the VA thinks about this.
Why are you getting so much pushback on this?
Well, so there's the New York Times did a story on this, right. And on the 7th of January of this year. And some of the pushback is driven by the fact that I'm a flawed messenger, right? I have a lot of advantages over a lot of other people who would otherwise be in similar situations. I have a PhD. I'm, all of that. And so they're saying, well, yeah, what does this guy know? Or they're saying he can't possibly identify with what's going on in my life, and that's true. That makes sense to me. Another part of it is that I think there's a sense of, in a lot of people who are milking the system, or in people who are milking the system, there's a sense of guilt associated with that, and it makes them feel very uncomfortable when somebody says, "Hey, maybe you shouldn't really be paid for this condition and this condition and this condition," because I know all kinds of people who have that condition that's not for their service, they're not getting paid for it by the government. And so some of it is, I think, a sense of guilt, and then some of it is a sense of, hey, I want to protect what I believe I've earned. And they're told this lie that if you serve in the Army for a few years, that you've earned whatever society can give you forever. And I don't think that's true. I think that's a mistake. But that's much more. That's a big moral argument. It's not just a financial argument.
I said in the beginning, you speak with credibility because you were wounded in Iraq. What happened?
So I was wounded twice in Iraq. The first time I was wounded was by a rocket-propelled grenade, which struck my tank on the 10th of November of 2004 and killed my loader. The loader is one of the positions on the tank. Wonderful young man named Dennis Miller. And then 2 months later, I was hit by a roadside bomb. I was in my Humvee. At the time, I was a company commander. I had 120 guys working for me, and I was going out on patrols all the time. And my Humvee was hit by a roadside bomb, which basically blew up underneath me as I was sitting in the Humvee, and severely damaged my right leg, knocked me unconscious, and I was unconscious for about a month, during which time I had 20 or so surgeries, including the amputation of my right leg. Ultimately, I spent about 6 months in the hospital and 6 months as an outpatient, and then during which time I had maybe 40 surgeries or something. It was a bad time.
Tell me the story about your daughter and the Legos.
Oh, how funny. You've been Googling me. So this is, I think everybody's gone through hard times, has some formative moments. And there's this moment in my life where I could have gone either way. It'd been a pretty dark time. I had a broken pelvis. I was very weak. my hands were damaged. I was just in bad shape. And my daughter was then not quite 3 years old. I'm in this power wheelchair, and my wife was in the other room of the place we were staying. My daughter, who's just a little kid, is playing on the floor with Legos, and she says, "Daddy, come play Legos with me." And here I am, broken pelvis. I'm just messed up, and I certainly don't want to be sitting on a hard wood floor, And I say, "I'm sorry, baby, I can't." That's that disability, I can't idea. And she turns around and she says under her breath, she goes, "My daddy can't do anything." And I'm a hard-headed enough, proud enough man that I was like, no way. And so I turned off the wheelchair so it wouldn't run away on me, and I crawled out of the thing and I sat on the floor and I played Legos. And my wife came around the corner and she saw me sitting on the floor, and she went, I heard her go like that, and she ran to get her camera, and she came back and she shot a picture, which I have still. I was looking at it last night, actually. And it's this picture of me, very sick, playing with my daughter. And to me, that was a turning point. That was a moment when I said, you know what, yeah, I'm pretty scuffed up, to use my term. I'm pretty scuffed up, but I'm not going to let that be the thing. I'm gonna make something out of my life, and I'm going to help other guys as much, and of course, gals too, but I'm going to help other guys do the best they can and thrive as much as they can, even though something bad has happened to them.
You're an Ironman athlete too, right?
I've done a whole bunch of half Ironman, and I did one full Ironman. I have a funny Ironman story. So I pedal the bike with just one leg, right? So it's a 112-mile bike, and I'm riding it with one leg, and I passed this guy in mile 50 of the bike. This is in 2010 at Ironman Arizona. I passed him in mile 50 of the bike, and I hear him say under his breath, he goes, "Oh my God." He's like, "I suck." It was really funny. When you get passed by a one-legged man, it may be time to quit doing Ironman. But it was a pretty funny experience. I sucked his life force, and I used it to propel the rest of the race.
You, speaking of bicycling, you've done some bicycling with George W. Bush. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it was great. So I got invited in 2012 and then again in 2013 to ride in the W100. So President Bush, since he's not president anymore, has done a bunch of things to honor wounded warriors. It's a very big part of who he sees himself as post-presidency. And I got a chance to ride bikes with him. And there was this really great picture of him like sort of pushing me up this steep hill, because on a mountain bike it's very difficult to get the low-end power you need to get up these hills. And so he's pushing me up this hill, and we just had a great time. It was in Texas, and then the next year was on his ranch in Texas.
Tell me about the first time you met him.
So the first time I met him was when he came to he came to Walter Reed on July 1st of 2005, when he was still president, and he was doing Purple Hearts. And a whole bunch of people had offered to pin my Purple Hearts on me, and because I hadn't had them presented yet, and I said, no way, this cost me a lot. I'm waiting for the president, So finally, the president came, and he did my first Purple Heart, and he turned to walk to the next person, and his aide said, "Sir, actually, Captain Gade has two." And so he turned back and he did my second one, and he said, "This is the first time I've ever done two on one person." And I said, "Sir, I make an excellent target." And he thought that was pretty funny. So he's been, on the number of occasions that I've met him, I've interacted with him socially and then obviously professionally as well. And he is a tremendous person who cares deeply about wounded warriors. I was in this meeting one time where he looked at some guys who'd gotten maimed in Iraq, and he said to them, "I personally made the decisions that got you in your life where you are today, and my government will do everything it can to make it right." And I just thought that was big of him. You don't see politicians very often of either party, of any generation, saying, "Hey, this is me. This is my responsibility." And for him to say that to these people who'd paid a high, high price was really a pretty special moment.
I can imagine so. As you've gone around and talked about the changes you would like to see with the VA, what kind of response are you getting from your fellow wounded warriors?
It's funny. I get a tremendous response from my fellow wounded warriors, and I also get a tremendous response from VA clinicians, medical providers, all these people who are immersed in the day-to-day work of providing for wounded warriors. I got hundreds of emails after the New York Times article, and they ran about 9-to-1 for my position, saying, "You're exactly right, and here's why. I've seen myself get pried away from the workforce. All I want to do is work and provide for my family, but I can't because I'll lose all this money." It's a pretty tough position for them to be in, and they recognize that. And they know that I want them to succeed. I'd rather have a guy earn $6,000 a month providing for himself than get $3,000 a month from somebody else and have that sense of, is this right? And that sense of gnawing guilt. And I think it's better for guys.
What about the politicians? What do they say to you?
Behind closed doors, people are saying, yeah, the VA is a disaster. Its spending has tripled in the last 15 years. Tripled in 15 years. But publicly, many of them are afraid to say anything because the interest groups come out of the woodwork and say, Senator Weeks doesn't support veterans, and here's how we can prove it, because he proposed this other alternate system. Any system that cuts any tiny little benefit, they come out of the woodwork for. And so publicly, they're running scared. Privately, everybody agrees that this is a bad system and that it's hurting people. And it's a shame. It's a human tragedy.
What about you? Politics?
Oh, no. No, I've got two more years left in the Army, and I enjoy my time in the Army, and I'm a nonpartisan military professional. I'm not doing this for any kind of partisan political reasons. After that, I don't know. I tell people I have three priorities. I want to serve God, I want to serve others, and I want to provide for my family. And as long as I'm meeting those criteria, I don't care.
Yeah. What do you teach at West Point?
So I teach basically leadership and ethics now. I was a political science professor for 3 years, and now I've sort of transitioned to this other department at West Point, and I'll be doing that for the next 2 years.
Well, I got a couple of minutes here. What makes a good leader?
Wow. That's an interesting question. That's a great question. Kind of a departure from what I was expecting. One of the things that makes a great leader is being willing to take responsibility. First, the most important thing is ethics and morality, and having a strong core of who I am as a person, and what I will and will not do, my morality, my ethics matter a great deal, probably more than any other thing. Secondly, I think it's really important to take responsibility for stuff that goes on around you. You know, the idea that I'm responsible for everything my organization does or fails to do leads to all kinds of positive behaviors in terms of training people who are struggling, helping people who are weak, et cetera. And I think the most fundamental principle of leadership, honestly, is love. That I love others enough to tell them the truth. I love others enough to help them succeed. And I love others more than I love myself. I'm not going to be selfish. I'm not going to be self-centered. I'm not going to seek glory. I'm going to serve others. And I think that's the most important principle.
That's interesting. I never thought of it that way. I can't say that I've ever heard anyone else ever say that. Love.
I'm going to be cheesy here for a second. It's from 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7, right? Love is patient, love is kind, it doesn't boast, right? You've heard this before, but if you think about that in a leadership context, imagine working for a leader who's patient, kind, not boastful, not seeking his own glory. I mean, that's a really powerful, wouldn't you want to go to work? Yes. You know, and so that's kind of how I think about that.
Yeah, the young, and I've got about 1 minute, but the young people that you're teaching today, what are you seeing? What are they like? What do they feel?
I get to teach some of the most remarkable students in the world at West Point. They are passionate, they're motivated, they want to serve their country, but they're, you know, in some cases they're millennials, right? They don't know what they don't know, and so you get to see this sort of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, you know, sort of thing. And what's really fun for me is exposing them to the world and saying, okay, the world is an evil, ugly place, and you are required to go into it as a person of great character and to change not only the group around you, but to spread your influence to others and to help others succeed. And so it's really fun to do that.
What a genuine pleasure to meet you.
My pleasure.
Best of luck to you, and
Thanks so much.
Thank you for your service to our country.
Thanks so much.
We appreciate it.
All right.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade on this edition of Conversations. By the way, you can see more of our conversations online at WSRE.org/conversations. Also, we're on YouTube and Facebook. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take great care of yourself. We'll see you soon.
Support for this program is provided in part by these corporate sponsors. And by viewers like you.
I'm Jeff Weeks, and I love to talk, but I find I learn a lot more when I listen. I hope you'll listen in on the next Conversations as we talk with engaging personalities from all walks of life. It's real conversation that matters.